Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of From the Lighthouse. Now, I have been very excited about this episode. I think we're going to have some fun today. So Michelle and I are here with a special guest, and that's Dr Kirstin Mills, who teaches in the Department of English here at Macquarie University. And Kirstin is a specialist on all things fantasy literature, which is obviously very relevant for our purposes here today. I should also explain that Kirstin is here as our resident Harry Potter expert. I am here as your medium Harry Potter expert, and my dear friend Michelle is here as somebody who knows absolutely nothing about Harry Potter.
The last living relic of a Harry Potter free mind. Yes.
Michelle is the last living human being who has no knowledge of Harry Potter, so this is going to be a fun one, guys. All right, we might start with Kirstin. Kirstin.
Thank you for having me. Well, I guess one of the most interesting things about Harry Potter is how it's become this huge sensation. It's kind of moved beyond books at this stage. Obviously, there are the films, but it's such a part of pop culture now that I'm sure, Michelle, perhaps you could say something about what you do know about Harry Potter, having never read the books.
Do you know, I have actually been to the Powerhouse Museum and seen an exhibition of Harry Potter stuff. So, because having children, and although I have to admit, because their mother doesn't read Harry Potter, they just haven't read them. But my friend has a son who, since the age of about 2, has actually insisted upon wearing a sort of wizard hat. And actually, we went through the whole exhibition, and he was fully decked out as Harry Potter. Including glasses, and he was no more than 3.
Isn't he too young to have read the books?
No, he hasn't. I don't know. No,
he probably knows them through the films.
I don't know, because they're quite violent. I'm now thinking, but I don't want to sort of make my friend seem like a bad mother, but I mean, I'm thinking that, he was really young to have watched those films.
Is he the elder sibling, or are there other kids he interacts with that are familiar with Harry Potter that he would have picked it up from?
I didn't interrogate it at the time. I did not interrogate my friend. She asked me to go to the Powerhouse Museum, which must have been some years ago, and I did. And I felt like I was being a good mother, because although I haven't actually read Harry Potter to my children, at least I'm taking them to a museum exhibition on Harry Potter, which in itself is a fascinating, sort of phenomenon that a book has actually reached the point where you can have proper sort of museum exhibitions.
I did go to that exhibition myself many years ago. I don't remember much about it. But I agree. How many books have museum exhibitions set up around them? I can't think of many at all.
Exactly. I find it particularly interesting because looking at the genre, I'm a reader obviously that's familiar with fantasy books, other books. And one of the it's both a criticism and a celebration of the Harry Potter books is that it got kids reading. That was one of the big sort of catch cries of the marketing campaign, was that, kids started reading, but then academics started looking into how they're reading and what they're reading, and they found that they're reading Harry Potter and then going back to the beginning and reading Harry Potter again, rather than branching out and reading other books. Now, that might be changing. I think more and more books are starting to be published now that are catching on to the Harry Potter marketing sort of phenomenon, that are differing themselves enough to establish their own pathways. But, it's a really interesting question about what comes first in terms of, are these books original, or is there something else going on there?
Well, I mean, when I was first, I came to Harry Potter a little bit late. I think I picked up the series when maybe the 5th or the 6th book came out. And when I first was introduced to them, and I was older, I was an adult, I wasn't a child, I noted straight away, first book, Roald Dahl.
Definitely, yeah.
The whole first book, scream Roald Dahl, especially the Dursleys, Harry's adopted family, or his aunt and uncle, it seemed to me straight out of Roald Dahl. And that impression, they get darker as they go along, obviously, because Harry grows up. And so that impression kind of fades for me, like it seems less Roald Dahl-ish as it goes along. But through that first book, I thought, oh God, I've read so many books like this before.
Definitely. I thought so too. And I think there, the tone is possibly very Roald Dahl, as well as some of the characters. We've got the twits in there, you know, Matilda's family, very much like the Dursleys. But yeah, the tone, I think, the humour, the emphasis on humour is something that Rowling keeps returning to in interviews. She keeps referring to her jokes are funnier than other people, or things like that.
Yeah.
Until we get to Roald Dahl, which is interesting. She refers to C.S. Lewis, because people keep bringing up similarities, saying, are you inspired by this text? Are you inspired by that one? She says, well, with C.S. Lewis, her jokes are funnier. C.S. Lewis is very preachy. But with Roald Dahl, who is obviously quite a master of humour and is well known for that, she says her books are different because they're more moral. So we kind of go the other way. So she's kind of somewhere in between C.S. Lewis and Roald Dahl in that respect.
Well, because I mean, in actual fact, my sort of text, my sort of Harry Potter was C.S. Lewis, and I actually attempted to read C.S. Lewis to my children because I have the anthology, and unfortunately C.S. Lewis, I think in terms of language, doesn't hold up. I mean, I don't think he's making any attempt to be funny, which makes it a sort of a moot point, but I think that unfortunately there is something very archaic and sort of convoluted in his syntax that actually and dated in his language that sort of prohibited my children from losing themselves in that book the way that I did. And I think the other thing is that sort of in my generation, which is pre-internet, sort of Disney, sort of franchise movies, pre so much. It's almost a foreign world. I lost myself in C.S. Lewis, and then I guess my reading sort of grew from there because I was forever looking for books that would replicate that experience, and because there weren't movies to sort of to follow on, because there weren't sort of infinite number of the merchandising and the additional sort of paraphernalia that goes along with and also because C.S. it was a finished, he was dead. I'm pretty sure he was dead by that time. There were no more that were coming, and so there was no sort of sense of a living author who was going to continue meeting my demand for more, and so the only option available to me was actually to go further afield.
Yes, exactly.
Which I guess isn't the case of reading these days, because most terrifyingly is that even if Rowling herself isn't willing to continue writing Potter, we have sort of infinite number of people willing to create supplementary or substitutions for what she's doing until it all sort of dies a natural
Particularly
death.
as the property of Warner Brothers now. We've got the film franchise, we've got spin-offs, we've got all this extra stuff going, toys, everything. I think that's a really interesting point about the that I think that's part of the key success of Harry Potter, was that Rowling was writing as they were publishing. So with the publishing history, the first 4 books were published really quickly because they wanted to catch readers. They wanted to get them in, get them going. But by then, I think the next one took about 3 years to write. And within that time, though, Rowling's doing interviews, and people would ask questions, what's going to happen next? What happens to Snape? What happens to Dumbledore? What happens to this? And she says, I know the answers, but I'm not going to tell you. And so it's that baiting, that hooking, whereas a lot of other authors that we might read, particularly ones that are long gone, Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, we don't have that anymore. We have just the finished product. We read it, and it's kind of a closed text in that way. But yeah, Rowling keeps this alive, and it's part of this grand idea that it's a living thing as opposed to a closed book.
She's still doing that. She's still doing that through Pottermore, her website. She keeps giving us more and more information. Years and years after the book series is finished, she keeps, saying, "Oh, but I didn't mention this about this character, and I didn't mention this." So she's still keeping readers on the hook in this way.
But it's kind of disingenuous, really, isn't it? I mean, I'm kind of surprised by the naivety of those questions, because I mean, in any sense, for me, I'm having a sort of a category sort of mistake experience inside my brain, because I'm just thinking, don't people realise that they could just as easily make up these alternative endings? And it's and it is sort of part of that cult of the author, isn't it? Because the author is the only one who can actually give you the valid alternative or the valid, sort of continuance of something, which is in actual fact incomplete. Sort of it completely contradicts the very nature of fiction in some respects.
That's right, yeah.
Or what it does is it creates a very particular sense of what an author is, what an author's power is, what an author does.
Yeah.
And in a really deferential and fascinating way, which is then countered by all of the spin-offs and derivatives and sort of fan fiction and all of those sorts of things, which sort of shows this incredible sort of cornucopia of what is sort of Harry Potter and our shifting understandings of.
I wonder if that has anything to do with the fact that as child readers we're more likely to be immersed in those worlds and kind of not be as cognizant of the fact that you're reading fiction, because I remember I also grew up with C.S. Lewis, and I remember doing things like squirreling around in the back of wardrobes hoping to find Narnia and so forth.
Oh, you too, Stephanie.
Yeah, of course. you knew I was, of course. So maybe that kind of impulse to find out what happened next is because we as kind of child readers or young adult readers, we're more likely to kind of think about these fictional worlds in a way that blurs the lines between fiction and reality, whereas I think as detached adult readers we're more likely to go, okay, well, this is a literary creation and how is it made, and think about literary constructs and so forth in a much more kind of extended way.
I think in this case the boundaries there are being blurred. Going back to what Michelle was saying in terms of, I think this is where celebrity meets literature. We've kind of got this weird, especially with Twitter. Rowling's very active on Twitter, and this is the sort of sphere in which fan ideas about characters get put forward, but Rowling either agrees with them or puts them aside and says, no, that's wrong. And this is this authority. She's stamping down as authority on her own literature, which is fine, except that this whole death of the author, once the text is out there, who's to say her continuing ideas about what it might mean, which could be changed later. We've had this in, when she starts bringing politics into it and using Harry Potter as an analogy for current political situations.
Oh my God,
and there's
Father.
questions about whether, when did that meaning come into it? Is she using it retrospectively? Who has the power to do that?
In some sense, it sort of maybe goes some way to explaining the phenomena, because in some sense, Rowling is God, and it's making the world feel safe because there are answers and right and wrong and truth. And
well, I found that interesting as Trump was inaugurated, all of the memes and so forth on Twitter about how we needed to summon Dumbledore's army in order to defeat him, which is either hilarious or actually really telling.
I think both.
Oh my God, Father, I had no idea.
And Trump as like a Voldemort figure.
Yeah.
So obviously she wasn't thinking about Trump when she was writing the novels, because the novels seriously predate Trump as a political figure. But they've been co-opted as a kind of way of rallying the troops, so to speak, as a kind of resistance movement.
Which in turn adds more of a sense of legitimacy and going back to this, what makes the book so popular, this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy of if something is so prevalent in the public sphere, it must have merit. Either it's extremely original, it's the first of its kind, or it's the best of its kind. And I think the Harry Potter phenomenon's kind of gathered those labels as it's gone on, not without some resistance, but in most people's eyes, we have a huge swathe of the global population familiar with Harry Potter, but not familiar with any other fantasy literature. In fact, I've actually talked to people that say, I hate fantasy, I'd never read fantasy, except they've read Harry Potter, they love Harry Potter. Because everyone else does.
I was wondering, Kirstin, if you could talk to some of those precursors of Harry Potter, because I think that a lot of fantasy literature gets very short shrift because people sort of assume that Harry Potter came into the world as this, product of Rowling's imagination and that nothing like it was ever done before. But just as we've mentioned with Dahl, there's so much that predates this.
So much. It comes right out of a really rich context. The 70s and 80s particularly were really fertile ground for fantasies being published. We've got heaps of them. But Rowling herself, this is one of the most interesting quotes, I think. She says, the question you're most frequently asked as an author is, where do you get your ideas from? As she says, I find it very frustrating because, speaking personally, I haven't got the faintest idea where my ideas come from or how my imagination works. Wow. And here's the deflection. I'm just grateful that it does because it gives me more entertainment than it gives anyone else. So it's got a lovely sort of emotional meaning attached to the end. But the key part there is that there's no acknowledgement of how her imagination works or what sources she's drawing from. Now, even if you're not consciously drawing from many of the very similar texts that were published around the time that she was writing, I think in retrospect at some point you're aware of the history, or you can flag the genre that you're drawing on.
I'm also thinking E.B. White and the chivalric, sort of Arthurian sort of legends as well. Sort of the Merlin figure for me is just, it just leaps off the page. And I think, I know that, sort of part of my sort of literary landscape is, C.S. Lewis, Tolkien, White, all of the, sort of nameless authors that I've read that have in some ways, sort of sculpted as something that made, those motifs like the castles, the flying broomsticks, the aged men, all of this sort of thing, incredibly resonant and
recognizable too.
Just not in any way, shape or form anything that I haven't seen before.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think readers that are already familiar with these things don't have a problem recognizing them. People familiar with the fantasy genre, even just through C.S. Lewis or Tolkien or things like that, don't have that problem recognizing them. But then young children whose first encounter is Harry Potter often don't look too far beyond that, because we've got C.S. Lewis, I think, is harder to read than Harry Potter. Tolkien's definitely harder to read than Harry Potter. A lot of them are. And a lot of the books that it draws on, it's quite similar to, are just older, and they didn't have that massive global impact that Rowling's text had. Things like, I've got my old little copy of Spell Me a Witch, Barbara Willard. That's a little 70s gem. And there's also The Worst Witch, which is enjoying a renaissance of a TV series at the moment. So that's Jill Murphy, and that's one of the ones that was published before Harry Potter. But critics often didn't do their research and would say, so are you copying Harry Potter? Yeah, and this happens classically to a lot of people. Ursula Le Guin,
Marvelous,
30 years before Harry Potter.
I know, writing.
Lynn Jones strikes me as somebody,
Definitely, she's in there. So a lot of these authors are being questioned about, so, is Harry Potter where you got your ideas? As if Harry Potter comes first, and it's just because it's almost the loudest voice in the room, but it's by no means the original or the first or necessarily the best.
Do you think it has something to do with the facility of the language? Because in some sense, sort of in having originally, I guess, written this story with a younger audience in mind, we have language that offers us no resistance, and I think that perhaps deep down it might, because I think it's hard to compare, what would C.S. Lewis have done today? Given the, sort of the possibilities of sort of internet, Twitter, it's almost impossible to compare. I don't think it was possible for that sort of global phenomenon.
No, definitely. This is a
without
thing,
the technology.
I think it happened at that particular moment of this increasing sort of globalization, the sort of the rise of the internet, chat forums, people. This is a viral marketing at the very beginning of word of mouth when the internet gets involved. Suddenly word of mouth becomes global.
And it's also speaking in the tongue of this particular generation.
Definitely.
And because one of the things I sort of see the other side of that, because on one hand, sort of children and my brother's children all devoured Harry Potter, sort of, and lived in, as you said, and relived and lived and relived. But what I see is especially as is writers, because I teach creative writing, and so what I see is a huge spike in the number of sort of students who sit down and write fantasy, and with absolutely and only Harry Potter in mind.
Exactly.
Which for me seems, there's a tremendous paucity in that approach, because there's no ability to sort of think through tropes or to think through traditions and inheritances and also just that very deep sort of history and fascination that makes something compelling. And
I think that's one thing that Rowling does have. Now, whether readers recognise this in her works or not, she is aware. She cites British mythology, she draws on the classics, the Bible, she acknowledges T.H. White, The Sword and the Stone, things like that. But her writing is steeped in very educated reading and research about all these different things. So she's working these traditions into her text, which is the only reason why I think not acknowledging more recent, examples of the genre. I'm not sure if that's a marketing thing, because we have this idea of divine inspiration, almost the magic of imagination, one person's mind that is so far above everyone else, so brilliant that it could come up with this whole world. Except lots of people are also coming up with similar worlds, but we're not acknowledging them.
I think that idea of Rowling as this, divinely inspired creator of worlds is something that's really part and parcel of her marketing. She I think that she cultivates that image of her as this divinely inspired genius. But as you were talking about influences on her, I was also thinking of Enid Blyton, because underneath all of these books there's one book per year of school.
Yes.
And it takes you from the beginning of the school year to the end of the school year. And all of them, even book 7, which kind of deviates from that school setting, even that kind of takes you from the beginning to the end of a school year. These are boarding school books.
They definitely are.
I used to devour boarding school books, and I think she is kind of disingenuous by not kind of copying to those kind of influences in the way that her imagination is formed, because she's working with such established genres.
Very established.
She's entirely capitalizing on that kind of romantic notion that we tend to have, especially those of us who, growing up in Australia, most of us didn't attend boarding schools, but that kind of really romantic notion of like having fun with your friends and having all of these adventures and you were going to save the world in your spare time, etc.
I think so too. There's speaking of Ursula Le Guin, as we were before, a positive thing she says about Rowling is that she gave the fantasy genre a boost. Whether that's true or not, because as we said, people tend to read Harry Potter and then reread Harry Potter rather than reading other fantasy authors. But she does also say, this is her quote, "I didn't feel she ripped me off, as some people did, though she could have been more gracious about her predecessors. My incredulity was at the critics, who found the first book wonderfully original. She has many virtues, but originality isn't one of them." Now, I think that's true. Now, I don't want this to come across as a criticism. I don't think lacking in originality per se is a bad thing, because she's working within a genre, and it's a wonderful genre. It's intertextuality. If anything, it makes the books wonderfully rich, because if you know the sources, you can then follow them up, and you can expand your worlds, your understanding of magical worlds and things like that.
It's also part of the writing process.
It is, and there is no text that is completely original. No. So I think the problem there is when either your marketing campaign or your readers start to claim that it is original and cut it off, divorce it from its sources, which I think in a way dilutes the potential power there. You can get so much more out of reading a text like this if you're aware of everything that's come before it.
I think it's actually part of the pleasure too, because I remember picking up the first book, and as I said, I had those resonances with Dahl and with Enid Blyton, and that actually was part of the appeal, because it felt like putting on a warm pair of pajamas or something. It was like going somewhere where I'm familiar and comfortable, and I knew how it was going to sort of pan out. I didn't obviously know all of the twists and turns of the plot, but I thought, okay, by the end of this book, Harry will have finished his first year at Hogwarts, and some kind of adventure will have happened, but he's going to be okay, and he's going to live to the next book, because the next book's called Harry Potter 2. So, I knew that he was going to be fine in the end, and it made me just feel warm and comfortable.
But I also think the most fascinating part of that is sort of inverting that phenomenon and sort of thinking through, why does a particular sort of generation or sort of audience need X, Y, and Z? And for me, there's something really egocentrical about claiming, sort of soul creative genius. And so that's, as you say, it's very much part of a marketing campaign that speaks to a whole population who want to be, who want authors who want sort of things to actually reside within sort of the individual imagination, as though the individual imagination is somehow, first of all, divorced from its social network and its traditions, and also terrifyingly from its history, because I think as soon as we start forgetting our history, we walk into really sort of dangerous territory, and that's what scares me. But also I keep thinking about the tropes that are being employed. Rags to riches. I've never read Harry Potter, but I know she wrote it, or I believe she wrote it in the car. Is that right?
She wrote it, I think, in cafes and in the car, and she was a struggling single mother for a while as she was writing it. And obviously now her wealth is beyond astronomical. So, you know, there's a bit of life imitating art, because Harry Potter is this, you know, starts off as this raggedy little creature and then becomes, you know, the chosen one, the saviour of the world.
Which is mirrored in the marketing campaign of Rowling's success.
Yeah.
She is that raggedy, sort of unfortunate down and out that became good and was the chosen one to represent writers everywhere and the, you know, powers of imagination.
And Rowling capitalises on that link between her and Harry Potter because, you know, she puts Harry Potter's birthday on her birthday. So it's all become part of this kind of mythology of Rowling. And I think it says such interesting things about literary celebrity in the 20th, in the late 20th, early 20th century.
It also really scares me, because what I'm listening to is I'm listening to sort of Ursula Le Guin, who's had, you know, sort of a really eloquent position on Google, on Amazon, on so many really vital sort of elements that are shaping, you know, sort of reading and actually subjectivity as we speak. So, but what you hear is that what she's doing is she's offering us a very sort of nuanced and far more sort of complex understanding of any one phenomenon. And what we're doing is we're going, yeah, well, that's the book that goes okay but doesn't go ballistic, and what we're wanting is the book that tells us that there's one author, one source, one beginning, and in actual fact it starts to feel more Trump-like than
yes,
you
when
know,
you put it that way. I think people crave I think we do
Simplicity.
crave simplicity. We crave a simple answer. We crave comfort. We crave someone saying it's all going to be okay. It comes down to good and evil, and if you just focus on love and friendship and trust and those things, that's great. But then when you start looking at,
when we're living in a really complex world which is completely and utterly beyond you know, those sorts of very simple
that's the
solutions.
thing, and that's what I think the power of Ursula Le Guin. One of the things she says, and she's obviously very much into psychology, into Jung particularly, and his connections with what artists are doing and symbolism and things. And it's very much about readers making their own meanings, which, as we were saying before, is something that I don't necessarily think Rowling is doing. She's not necessarily allowing you to believe whatever you like, because she's actually saying certain people are wrong.
But it's also a straightforward read. It's one of those other sorts of moments which, you know, and I think the thing that's really important is that there's nothing wrong with those reads. Like, I don't believe in sort of that hierarchy where, you know, like you can't, there's something inherently wrong about sitting down and reading like that. I think what it is, it's when it sits uncritically and it becomes a formative and a productive, you know, sort of power in itself. And I mean, I guess, I don't know. I mean, considering that the way that we're going to sort of fight Trump is by calling on our armies of, what are we calling? Dumbledores. We're going to call. I mean, I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that you know, that's a strong military tactic or a strong tactic. But I'm not convinced that I'm not convinced that it's going to get very far. I don't know. Like, it's just my suspicion.
As symbolism, I think for the readers, it's powerful. It represents dissent against authority, you know, of a horrible kind. It represents standing up for what you believe in, essentially. Going back to what you said about history, though, I find this really interesting. We're talking about the cult of sort of celebrity and author, and the way it's divorced from history and it kind of gathers its own authority. There's recently, the British Library's just recently announced that it's having its own exhibition on now it's on the history of magic. So it's gathering ancient sort of texts through its collection on alchemy, on sorcery, spells, all of these wonderful things have nothing to do with Harry Potter, except that they are the sources of inspiration for Harry Potter. Now, the interesting thing is that the exhibition is entitled Harry Potter, A History of Magic. And they've got some illustrations, they've got some notes from J.K. Rowling, which is great. But what they're doing is kind of they're co-opting this Harry Potter phenomenon and retrospectively tacking it onto history. So they've got this wonderful historical exhibition, but one of the descriptions of it actually subtitles it an extraordinary new addition to J.K. Rowling's Wizarding World. But the new edition is hundreds of years old. So these are historical objects. We've now gone, hey everyone, look, this is now part of J.K. Rowling's world. And I feel like it's kind of the same thing. A lot of I hear a lot of whenever I'm in England, I hear a lot of American tourists, particularly. It doesn't matter where they're from particularly, but they seem to be American for some reason, walking through those little cobbled streets in York and Oxford, which were used in the Harry Potter films, and they go, oh, it's a Harry Potter street, you know. It's just, and so this quintessential British architecture, this historical sort of artifacts and things, are now Harry Potter artifacts. They're Harry Potter images.
Wow.
It's amazing how it's like an octopus. It's like its tentacles are everywhere, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, to brand the whole history of people
England.
dealing, the whole history of England, that's right, and the history of like magic and a belief in the supernatural is somehow exclusively of interest because it might illuminate something about Harry. I mean, that strikes me as both kind of laughable, but also kind of worrying. Like, I think that, I mean, on a kind of personal level, I kind of get annoyed at my students sometimes when they have when they show their kind of impulse to kind of go back and keep reading Harry Potter over and over again. I just think, there is so much more out there in terms of fantasy, and if you are, if you read Harry Potter and you're inspired and you think all of this kind of world of fantasy and magic and all this is really great, go out there and read something else. It'll make Harry Potter richer. It won't take you away from Harry Potter.
But I also think there's a tremendous power for subversion there, because I have a friend who curates a museum, and so, sort of the standard strategy is to have one big sort of draw card who, everybody in the actual art world may have moved past or doesn't actually think is that great, but they know that they will get, sort of the feet through the door.
Popular appeal.
And so you can sort of see this sort of strategy in place where, sort of get the people in, once they're in under the Harry Potter, shut the door and
yes,
sort of
you will
down
be
and have a serious
educated.
conversation.
Educate them by stealth.
That's right. I mean, I'm sure that's got to be. I can only hope.
Definitely. So it's got these positive and negative connotations.
But of course that whole what is it? It's just an inversion. It's a backwards. It's a sort of it's a disruption of chronology, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's just, I think again this sort of speaks to like almost co-opting this entire history of magic as if it's marketed as if it's almost an invention of J.K. Rowling again. She I think who was it, Neil Gaiman, or I think it was Terry Pratchett, I'm sorry, I can't remember which one, again wrote a very similar plot line to Harry Potter before Harry Potter was published, and was asked, did you steal J.K. Rowling's ideas? And he said, well, or was it after? I can't remember, but said basically, yes, of course I stole her ideas. Of course I used a time machine to do it. But I think that was Pratchett. It sounds like Pratchett.
Don't you love the quip? Yeah. But it is interesting because I mean I think sort of Gaiman is probably and Pratchett are sort of good sort of touchstones to think through, because I mean they've obviously been successful, but just not on that scale. And I wonder, sort of, because I mean I've always enjoyed Gaiman and Pratchett's writing, and I'm just now I haven't avoided them in the way that because I have to admit there's been at a certain point there was just I'm not reading Rowling. No, I'm not ever.
Right.
It's a point of principle. But yeah, I'm just curious as to sort of the features that allowed sort of the Potter phenomenon, whereas as I say, relatively speaking, it's a much more contained sort of fandom.
Well, I think Gaiman and Pratchett are very, very popular within a defined kind of fandom, I suppose, of fantasy readers, whereas Potter seems to be the thing that transcended fantasy circles and became, a general kind of phenomena. It's not nerd cred to have loved Harry Potter in the way that it's you're part of a kind of group, maybe, or a cool group who like Pratchett. Okay, I think that Harry Potter is the one that stood out, and I do think, to go back to your point before, Kirstin, about the internet and the rise of the internet, and canny marketing, and also I think that we've kind of been a little bit down on Harry Potter so far, but I also think they're just enormously entertaining.
Oh, they're absolutely, that's one of their biggest strengths. Go back to, we did mention how funny they are. They're very humorous. I think that's one of their keys, but it's also the way they balance humour and emotion. They've got real emotion in there. But also, particularly, this is another thing that Rowling comments on about books she likes. She often refers to the power of the narrator. And I think that's something the Harry Potter books use quite well. They use vocalization really closely. We're often told about Harry's hungry, or Harry's cold or scared or whatever. We're right there in his shoes, experiencing Hogwarts. And I think being in Hogwarts is almost more important than the adventures. I think it's the chance to go and live in a place. And we have this, Rowling often always says, she says that thing about Hogwarts is always there to welcome you home. It's that idea that it's a real place. We can go there anytime. We just have to open the books and keep rereading them because we want to keep going back to Hogwarts. And it's a lovely, comforting, wonderful idea. I just wish she would open some of the doors of Hogwarts and show us through to other worlds created by other fantasy writers.
Yeah, and I think that another strength of hers that really struck me when I was first encountering these books is her characters.
Yes.
She's really good at creating these different kinds of characters. So you've got, Harry, who's the hero and the central focus, but then you've also got wonderful kind of side characters, and she also does adult characters quite well.
Yeah.
Usually in young adult or children's literature, the adults can be kind of shadowy presences, but she does some really, really vivid adult and complex adult characters. Not necessarily, Dumbledore's a great example of that. He's not, an unflawed character, but he's not a monster at the same time. So she has the capacity to incorporate nuance into her characters. And personally, when I read the Harry Potter books for the first time, I just latched on to Hermione Granger, because, come on, a girl who loves books with frizzy hair, it spoke to my soul.
Yeah, I think, in that way, when I was reading her works, I came across them first time as a teenager, and I remember thinking how Dickensian her characters were, particularly the names as well. So he had that similar knack of a rip-roaring plot, very entertaining to read, with wonderful characters that the first time you saw them, you knew exactly what they were going to be about. So when we first meet Draco Malfoy, we know exactly what he's going to be like.
Yeah, because his name is Draco Malfoy.
Yeah. and the first thing he says is extremely arrogant.
Yeah.
Similar things with Ron and Hermione. I think, it's this very powerful, vivid evocation of a world, of character, of people and place, really, that makes it feel real. I think in that sense, partly that's why it makes it easy to read. What makes it easy to keep going back and reading.
Yeah, it's that kind of immersive experience that you get in really amazing children's literature, where you feel like you are in a world, in a kind of comforting world. I know it's not a fantasy example, but as a child I was very much into Anne of Green Gables, and I felt like I could walk into Anne of Green Gables' world and walk around and navigate it.
Yeah.
If I entered Green Gables, I'd be able to find the kitchen and all this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And she's very good at picking up on that kind of potential of children's literature, I think, to make you feel like you're immersed in a home, you're immersed in a kind of familiar environment, and that you're safe.
Yes.
Well, because I actually love that Dickensian sort of aspect of it, because I think, that makes a lot of sense to me. But the thing that I'm just thinking, listening to you both, is that really what she's done is, she's managed to sort of create both a new audience in the sense of the generations who've sort of never read C.S. Lewis, but what I'm hearing is this tremendous nostalgia.
Yes.
And I guess because one of the most, sort of the thing that's really boosted her sales, from what I understand, is the fact that she's just so read by adults.
Yes, that's right.
And so you can sort of see how, by some sort of miraculous and probably quite fateful sort of combination of events, she's actually sort of managed to both, sort of stimulate the imaginations of those who haven't read fantasy yet, while at the same time through, sort of completely and utterly immersing sort of older readers in pretty much everything that they could possibly have read. Because I'm hearing Dickens, I'm hearing Lewis, I'm hearing Tolkien, I'm hearing White, I'm hearing, so in a sense it's no wonder. And I'm thinking, maybe I'm going to have to read it, because if I'm going to revisit all of my, sort of childhood, sort of favourites, then I may be an absolute sucker for this book.
Yeah, I think it is. It's familiar and it's safe for the adult readers, particularly parents reading it to their children, who, by the time the movies came out a few years later, were old enough to take to the movies as a family event. And then these children grow up into older generations that keep rereading it and then read it to their children. And it starts... we're now in the world where the generation that grew up with Harry Potter is entering the workforce, and we've got this proliferation of people that are now super familiar with Harry Potter.
I think one of the cleverest things that Rowling did when she wrote the series is have the novels get older in their kind of orientation as Harry gets older.
Yes.
Because it really gives you a sense as a reader that you are growing up with Harry.
Definitely.
And that's why I think that some people have such a, especially if they read Harry Potter as a child, that they have such a strong emotional connection to these characters.
Yeah.
Because you aged as Harry aged. And so say, you first read the first book when you were 11, and then you might read the next book when you're 13. You were going through the same kind of developmental milestones as Harry, dealing with kissing girls all of a sudden, when he does, and all of this sort of thing. And so you she draws you into that kind of sympathetic reaction or engagement with Harry. And yes, as adult readers, and as I mentioned, I was an initial adult reader, it did give me a strong sense of nostalgia for that kind of reading experience that you have as a child, and then you can never really properly have again as an adult, because as an adult you can't kind of lose yourself in a book in the way that you do
exactly
as a child. And it made me just remember what reading was like when I was, a kid, and gave me that kind of sense of
pure
comfort,
enjoyment of it.
And almost not a turn your brain off response, because it's not that, but it's a kind of really pleasurable sinking into reading as pure pleasure.
I think the fact that you sort of mentioned that the books they get more complex as they go along as well, to sort of match the ages of the reading groups as they move along. So by the last one, it's a lot more complex than the first one. If you compare them, they're almost entirely different books. But yeah, I think you can also tell though in the writing when the movies start coming in. I felt as a reader, again, I was a teenage still at this point, or maybe early 20s, I'm not sure, but I felt like I could pinpoint when she was aware that it was going to be made into a movie, because scenes started to be written slightly differently, almost as if ready to be translated onto the screen.
I think that's a really interesting point.
Do you think craft improved? Sort of writing craft improved from sort of the first to the last?
I think so. In my opinion, it did.
I think so too, and I think that there was more kind of meat for parents, particularly, to sink their teeth into in the latter stages. And I think that's why that the books have this kind of political resonance now, because they started to become more about Harry versus corrupt authorities and corrupt kind of institutions, and there was more of a focus on the kind of political allegorical aspects of the texts in the latter text. So that I'd say from book 5 to book 7, that was much more of a focus, whereas the earlier books weren't necessarily devoid of those things, but they weren't the focus in the way that kind of more political, symbolic, allegorical aspect of the latter texts became.
And those aspects were handled well. Were they? I'm just curious, because I'm thinking that in terms of sort of understanding the sort of the immense popularity and sort of what significance sort of that sort of corruption of sort of people in power has in terms of generating that popularity.
I think because it started, I mean, we were talking about other popular authors, Dahl and everyone, Le Guin, but what they don't have, while they've got lots of books, they don't have a 7-book series that, with the books get progressively bigger as well, like hugely long.
Chunkster books, yeah.
So I think in terms of developing the meanings and the scope of the text, as they get longer, you can put more in them. But you've already done the groundwork. You don't have to reintroduce the society. So in book 1, you establish the world, the magic world. By book 7, we're very familiar with it, and so then we can start tinkering with the nuances within it, the political sort of differences. We're aware of different characters and what their motivations might be. I think it creates more context and more ability for us to understand it across 7 books in a series rather than a single novel.
Look, and I guess I'm also just very aware of other things that have sort of changed from, sort of in terms of reading practices and television watching practices and film going practices. And it seems to me that there is a sort of a real tendency for binging, in a way that just wasn't possible, sort of years before, things like, I guess, sort of Netflix, I guess things like, sort of, I don't even know, but I just feel that there is this really sort of, and I don't even know what that binging is, but it seems, because it's sort of a phenomenon that is foreign to me, because I don't, I don't understand that sort of, sort of ability to just completely and utterly immerse yourself, consume to that level of consumption. It's a really heightened sort of consumer quality, isn't it? It's like a hyper consumer, sort of really sort of late capitalist.
Well, that's the thing. I think that goes back to this sort of the timing of Harry Potter. Beginning of the internet, huge multimedia across all different. So we've got the Pottermore website. We've got a host of different fan websites. We've got Rowling on Twitter. We've got the the movies, we've got media just consuming it, we've got Harry Potter being used in marketing analogies and political commentaries, you know.
Yeah, and you know,
it's everywhere.
It struck me too that one of the kind of the fun parts of the initial kind of Harry Potter phenomenon was the kind of sense of event reading. You know, especially when the latter books came out, not so much the first couple of books because people were sort of still finding the series, but when the movies started to be to come out, and then there was these, you know, event parties on release night and so forth, there was a sense of kind of fun and a sense of that this is an event, that this kind of reading is an event, and people would, you know, get the book 6 or book 7 and read it over the next, you know, 10 hours or whatever, and then go on the internet and talk about, you know, what they thought and so forth. And so there was a kind of really interesting kind of binge on the books as they came out that then kind of flowed through into public discourse in such a huge way. And so then you get, you know, people, I remember when book 6 came out, there were, you know, people would put banners up on streets that spoiled the books and all of this sort of thing because it became such a kind of public event in the way that, you know, only kind of television had been a public event. You know, people used to talk about water cooler television and, you know, gathering around the water cooler the morning after a big TV show happened to discuss what happened. And Harry Potter, for me, was the first time that became part of the literary world.
So it's a social sort of activity, isn't it? And I guess it's also a way of inclusion and exclusion. But I'm also thinking that there's something insatiable about this. You know, like I keep coming back to this sort of insatiable quality
I think
of
that's
what
modern
it is.
culture now. You mentioned Netflix. There's that. Yeah, there are all sorts of memes that go around now about the reality that a lot of people don't sit down and watch a weekly episode of television anymore. We watch an entire series. Or 3 seasons, you know, in 1 day or 2 days. You know, we just sit there and just consume it. And if there are sort of ancillary texts, you know, like with the Harry Potter world, there's so much out there. There's just so much more to consume. And the more you consume, the more rooted you become in that world and more resistant, I think, potentially to other worlds. I know whenever I finish a Netflix series and start a new one, it takes me a while to get into the new one because I'm like, well, this isn't
This isn't the one that I've been
now familiar with. So it does take some work, I think, to open your mind to other styles of writing or television, other ideas, other worlds. But
And
I think
Rowling,
it's worth the effort.
Absolutely. And Rowling feeds you so much, doesn't she? She's constantly feeding you, and then the internet.
You almost don't have time to get hungry.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And the internet being what it is, you know, I remember watching videos on YouTube which I stumbled across, which were children or young adults doing the quizzes on Pottermore that tell you what house you're in. And I thought, you know, there's such an insatiable desire for content. I thought, why would anyone want to watch this? But then at the same time, people do. So that there's that kind of constant feeding of the audience that keeps them on the hook all the time. And so it becomes this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy where the more that Rowling gives you, the more you want, and so she gives you more and then you want more. And so there's this real cycle that's created. And I mean, if you're a Harry Potter obsessive, you're not going to complain, are you?
No, because I guess what we're identifying is that on one hand there is a book as we know it, as we've always known books, but it can't, or it can no longer be divorced from a machine. And that's probably, you know, sort of course, you know, it's this particular book which allows us to have that specificity in terms of understanding, you know, sort of this particular phenomenon. But what we're actually sort of gauging is you know, sort of this sort of ever-growing sort of, because, you know, like the number of media that you can experience this on, whether like you were talking about Twitter, you were talking about, you know, YouTube, because I know those things where you actually watch. I mean, I think there's one really weird one which my daughter stumbled across, where she was, and I was drawn into the room because I could hear this man with a Swedish voice, and it immediately sort of signalled alarm bells. I don't know why, and I walked in, and of course, what it is you can actually we've got this sort of enactment of, you know, sort of Harry Potter sort of moments happening. So somebody just doing a little sort of skit, I guess, but it's sort of like a YouTubey sort of thing, and so you YouTube, Twitter, you know, sort of
message boards,
you know, this sort of stuff, and so
a huge array of platforms that never used to exist.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
exactly. And to go back to your point about 70s and 80s fantasy, it's not like after you read Spell Me a Witch, you could go online and talk to,
No,
700
exactly.
other fans of Barbara Willard. You just had
Yeah.
to sit in your bedroom and go, I really liked that book.
Yeah.
By yourself.
Yeah, the most you would do is talk to your friends at school about it.
Yeah.
Which is fine, but that word of mouth only goes so far, and then you grow up, and you, particularly if it's not a series, you leave that at the age group at which you read it, and then you move on to other books. Whereas, as we were saying, Harry Potter or Rowling taps into that. She goes, okay, I'm going to stay with you as you grow, as you gather more reading skills. I'm going to still be there. You're going to keep reading me.
Well, and it's funny too, because Harry Potter and the Cursed Child, the play that's happening in London at the moment, is about Harry as a father.
Yeah.
So there you go. So her initial fans are growing up; they may be becoming parents themselves.
Yeah.
And now we have Harry Potter as a father for you to identify anew with.
But there's sort of that embedded irony too in a text that's sort of making the world sort of more manageable, more sort of more secure, more certain. It's actually generating this incredible chaos. It's adding to the cacophony that is modern existence in this incredibly sort of pixelated way that is sort of really just I'm feeling levels of anxiety sort of shooting
So are we encouraging you to read Harry Potter, or are we doing the opposite?
You almost had me for a moment when you started sort of talking about all those and now I'm just feeling terrified by sort of what's out there and the degree to which it's penetrated.
I think that's the thing. If we can just sort of extend the dialogue a bit around Harry Potter to be more aware of the other texts that are similar or share certain similarities but many differences as well. They're not all cookie cutters. Not by no means suggesting, I would never suggest that the fantasy genre is frivolous or that produces similar products. I think they're all wonderful. They all have their virtues. But we need to be aware of this ancestry, really. And even before, a lot of people refer to C.S. Lewis and Tolkien as if they kind of created the fantasy genre. Before them, we've got George MacDonald in the 19th century, William Morris even. We've got a huge array of writers. That's where my research really looks into, is the origins of the fantasy genre around that time. And it's, Walter Scott even earlier. We've got Frankenstein, things like that. The people don't read anymore. No one reads, well, not no one, but barely anyone. No popular audiences tend to read George MacDonald anymore, and yet C.S. Lewis draws so heavily on George MacDonald. And George MacDonald is using portals to enter magical worlds. We've got this whole coming-of-age story of a young man who realises his inner gift and goes into a magical world, things like that. Very similar.
I'm wondering also, sort of whether it's sort of that thing where on one hand we have the book, which I think we can talk about in these terms, but in actual fact the book is really dwarfed by the machine. You know what I mean? Like it's a lot of. Do you know what I mean? Like in some sense.
Well, also too, you can be a Harry.
Conflate the two.
You can be a Harry Potter fan and not read the books because you can access the movies and you can access the fan fiction and you can access the play or the musical or whatever. So you can actually be a dedicated and claim your status as a dedicated Harry Potter fan without ever touching the books.
Yeah, and I think even if you don't claim that you're a fan, I don't think there's anyone in the Western world at least that is not aware of Harry Potter and roughly what it's about, purely because of how prevalent it is across vast discourses.
Well, that's our friend Michelle here.
Yeah, exactly. That brings us back to our original point.
Yeah.
So.
That Michelle has never touched a Harry Potter book, but somehow
can talk for almost an hour about it.
Yeah. I really love your point, Kirstin, about like the 19th century and the earlier forerunners to Harry Potter, because I think that again they point to the sort of uncritical way that some people approach the books, but they also point to like all this potential. Like, is it there's so much potential for people to go out there and read all of this sort of stuff.
So much, yeah. And in a way, I'm hoping that's partly what the British Library exhibition will do. In co-opting hundreds of years worth of actual history as a new addition to the Harry Potter world. I'm hoping that it'll sort of ask readers to move beyond Harry Potter a little bit. Enjoy it for the wonderful, entertaining ride that it is, the great ideas. It is a wonderful use of imagination. Brilliant books. But there are so many more. That it is so many more cousins of Harry Potter, I would say, very closely related, just outside Hogwarts if you just take a few steps.
But also actually question that reading process and aren't there different ways of reading? And so we have our reading when we're really wanting to lose ourselves, immerse ourselves, but also that equally sort of important thing is the books that challenge us and make us actually think about the fabric of the lives that we're leading.
Yeah, and I mean, it would also, you know, we've talked about the kind of forerunners to Harry Potter, but there are also lots of books out there now. As you said, that there's been this flowering of the fantasy genre. So there's heaps of other books out there that are similar, fantasy, science fiction, and so forth. That readers of Harry Potter could very much appreciate. I'm thinking of the Magician series by Lev Grossman, which was marketed as a kind of Harry Potter for adults because it has a few sexy bits in it. And so there's much potential for Harry Potter fans, I suppose, to kind of venture out of the safe world of Hogwarts and discover something new, but something related.
Yeah, I think so. I think I'm looking forward to the day when we've got enough. I think Harry Potter will always be celebrated in some way. It's reached that classic status already that Roald Dahl before it has.
It's got
Lewis Carroll's.
That's right. Yeah.
So most texts that deal with real issues, but in a humorous, enjoyable way, worlds you can immerse yourself in. It's very much a book like that, and which is great. But I also look forward to the time where we publish books without needing to tag them with
Harry Potter for adults.
Like,
that would be
Harry
nice.
Potter. It would be nice to celebrate books in their own merit again. If it just comes down to this idea again of originality. If we could just drop the idea that Harry Potter is necessarily original, or that it needs to be original in order to be good, that would be great, because it's wonderful even though it's not particularly necessarily original.
No, I agree, and it would be. I think that Harry Potter has kind of already been kind of accepted into the canon of children's literature. It would be nice to see kind of. Maybe a little bit less attention paid to it and a little bit more attention paid to other kinds of similar works and to newer works as well. I mean, which is not to diminish Harry Potter, but also to say that, there's a lot of other stuff out there that's pretty cool.
That's the thing. I don't think Harry Potter needs to be lowered in any way or criticised or put down. That's definitely not what we're doing, rather than just raising up the other texts that it draws upon, raising them out of the shadows and saying, hey, well, look at this wonderful world that's open to us if we just look a little outside our comfortable boundaries.
Venture out of the Hogwarts hall, perhaps.
Yes.
Now I have to ask you, Kirstin, what house are you in?
Oh gosh. Doesn't everybody say Gryffindor?
No, I say Ravenclaw.
I thought you'd say Ravenclaw. I would say Gryffindor.
Okay. Well, I don't think we'll ask Michelle, because Michelle has no idea what we're talking about.
Me in a house. How does that sound?
I think that Michelle is definitely a Ravenclaw.
I'll ask you about that after, Stephanie.
Don't tell her what it means. All right, we might wrap up there. Thank you so much, Kirstin. That was amazing.
Thank you very much for having me.
We really appreciated your expertise, and thank you, Michelle, for bringing your uninformed opinions. We hope that we have not turned you off Harry Potter too much. All right, so we'll see you in another 2 weeks. Thanks, guys. That was fun.